Invasion Audiobook Finale Part. As matters now stood, by the end of Day 4's conclusion, with the war having been won at the hands of the Sino-Russian coalition forces, the yoke of the tyranny now foisted upon the peoples of the vanquished former nation state were now made fully manifest. This, as even prior to the invasion itself, thereby having completely and formally concluded at the end of the 96-hour / 4-day-long invasion, had been optically conveyed massively by the capture of millions of said defeated peoples. As such people were now pressed into servitude for the rest of their remaining lives. Of course, also, along with the deaths of many millions more, just before the viciously brutal invasion phase had even completely concluded in official terms. Even before the Cap City battle itself had thus finally concluded, propaganda forces of the CCP regime were busy and out in force, thereby actively filming the aftermath of combat. These forces were now slapping up Xi posters and CCP-related imagery all throughout the city. These were signs depicting a certain and undeniable current reality of Chinese domination over their newly won colonial possession. Thus, the city was in a sense painted red, not only via Chi-Com propaganda imagery and various banners and flags, but such proverbial painting was even literally the case, also being from the blood of the deceased, who still lay all throughout the city. These dead, still laying about, were now all for the defeated citizenry to work to clear, all while under threat of force. Rubble clearance and corpse removal would be a morbid task indeed, not to mention that their taskmasters would be firm and rough whenever required, and somewhat harsh with the defeated people. This was generally true of the local occupation forces, albeit many of them not totally savage, unless, of course, if given a reason to be, or if, of course, individuals found themselves in PAP-occupied zones, wherein the medieval barbarism and brutality of those paramilitary troops was a way of life for them. Vanquished American citizens were now the wards, or rather, the property of the CCP, and therefore had no rights of any sort. By late afternoon of the fourth and final day of the invasion phase itself, Pvt Li Chung of the PLA, having been involved in the capture of the Cap City of the now vanquished former USA, was relieved at having had survived the apocalyptic combat. Such having had occurred throughout the prior 4 days of the war thus far, and himself now looking forward to simply returning home soon to his family, and not so much even in celebrating and reveling in the total victory. Although such had been largely the case, Pvt Li Chung would indeed still be coaxed into celebrating along with the rest of his squad, and was even set to receive a special campaign ribbon for his formal dress green PLA uniform. These honors, as well as combat medals personally bestowed upon him for his specific valor displayed during combat within the city itself. He also was in line for a promotion to corporal from his private ranking. It truly was much worth celebrating, for he and many other troops would therefore receive various accolades, awards, and even promotions of their very own as well, all of which being born of the glories of final victory, all occurring in literally making history in every sense of the word, insofar as it related to the defeating of a long-hated enemy. Now, as Day 4 moved along, Pvt Li, before the ceasefire, had helped partake not only earlier in the 4th day of seizing part of the 3rd and final defense line and therefore mopping it up, but he even had helped to capture one of the key nodes and in the clearance of it, being, of course, the cap structure itself. Beyond this, they'd aided in mopping up areas adjacent to the mall itself on the south side of it, namely some former gutted museum buildings and tiny blocks left among those specific streets that were very briefly still held by the last diehards amongst the defenders. These last defenders within the museums and other rubbled or gutted husks were they who then finally surrendered. That is, if they didn't outright fall in battle or try to escape through increasingly limited means of even so doing. As the final defenders besieged within various rubble piles and gutted, ripped out structures filed out in surrender, leaving, of course, only the dead within such, the PLA and their allies then next proceeded to send forces down into the city's vast underworld. Moreover, the raiding of the underground was both to inform the defeated land's citizenry that they had officially lost the war, and also to gather them together gradually above ground. This being done, mostly at least for the time being, to sort through them to find enemy combatants in the guise of the defenders, attempting to hide in and among the hordes of unarmed civilians. As these missions would be quite time-consuming, they began to deal with these operations immediately by midday on the 4th and final day of the invasion. These thereby handled with troops filing downwards into the few undestroyed subway station entryways of the metro line and into the sewer system as well. PLA and Allied forces thus entering the sewers through manhole coverings or drainage tunnels of the aforementioned entry points to the city's underground, among other entrances having had been previously discovered, in addition to those of the metro. These were a tedious objective to clear for the invasion troops. Of such operations, only 2 battalions had been tasked to these proceedings. One belonging to the 92nd Infantry Division of the 31st Group Army, and the other belonging to the 93rd Infantry Division, belonging also to the 31st PLA Group Army. These forces moved as expediently and efficiently as was humanly possible. As these matters of thoroughly saturating the underground had thus proceeded onward, there came propaganda elements of the 31st Group Army's Independent Headquarters Battalion, itself encasing the command elements and associated subordinate support structure over the entire 31st Group Army, now beginning their operations corresponding to such objectives pertaining to total victory. In other words, these forces began to hurriedly hang up red banners and CCP party flags and national flags of China over all major few remaining key buildings, as well as placing posters and even several massive oil paintings of Xi Jinping that were therefore posted up throughout the nation's former regime quarter. These propaganda units already had conducted the video recording of various instances of intense combat footage throughout the course of the entire operation, and now were busy with the decorating of the hard-won enemy-capped city, now that hostilities were generally all over and done with. At least, this was the case throughout the above ground of the city itself. Underground beneath the city had seen mixed results, with the 2 battalions tasked with clearing it out encountering everything from demoralized, deeply dejected, and depressed civilians from news of their defeat, all the way to scattered instances of firefights thus ensuing and thereby occurring until their foregone conclusions. This, upon finding the former military and combatant aid, logistical, and rest stations beneath the ground within the tunnels. These ended quickly as the overwhelming sheer might of the PLA troops crushed any and all resistance in their paths. Some, though, surrendered only to join the prisoners above ground being marched or driven off in trucks to temporary POW holding areas just outside the city. Some such POW holding areas were now even in use within the confines of the local former American military bases ringing the city themselves. By evening, there was massive celebration already now occurring as Pakistani, Belarusian, and Chinese troops danced, sang, and in the case of the latter 2 nationalities, drank and consumed lots of liquor. Baijiu and vodka especially, in the case of the alcohol now being imbibed in enormous quantities. This, as such, had been sanctioned by commanders due to this very special occasion. Being as such the formal defeat of the USA via capitulation of its regime, which itself had been hated the world over. Of the liquor, the baijiu was a popular Chinese liquor, and of course the Belarusians partook in their vodka, as the respective commands of both forces delivered their victory drinks to their troops on several large pallets containing the many multiple bottles, which made it out into the field via dispersal to the headquarters battalions of the divisions or headquarters companies within combat battalions, next going down the line to the headquarters platoons of the various combat companies, who came to pick up a box of bottles for their company. Each box contained multiple bottles of roughly 26 ounces, essentially a fifth. Each squad per platoon of the different companies each got 2 bottles for their squad, or basically 1 bottle per every half squad, comprised of about 5 to 6 men. That certainly sufficed, needless to say, to cause intoxication of many men, who themselves, losing their inhibitions, acted between clownish to downright violent in some cases, with rare instances of beating on columns of POWs taken earlier among the former defending forces. This abuse was generally frowned upon, even by the PLA regulars, who felt more obligated to generally obey the Geneva Conventions, the PLA, of course, being a bit more civil. Such military men were unlike their savage PAP brethren, who were a savagely brutal paramilitary force. This force, who outright snubbed such agreements and strictly made and followed their own protocols or whatever the party hardliners put forth as orders. In other words, similar to the SS or other brutal paramilitary element contemporaries, or such elements throughout history, these men operated in much the same spirit. However, the PLA regulars, as opposed to the PAP, were mostly a paradoxical force in many ways. Extremely tough, but generally far more civil and lenient towards their prisoners taken, even towards irregulars wearing civilian attire. Even despite their civil demeanor, PLA forces were still highly reliable to the party and were 100% on board with the colonization of North America and other national goals of Red China, albeit, although not so much on board with the genocide, which itself, of course, was largely left to the hands of the PAP to handle, this as their ranks were filled with clinical sociopaths. By this point, drunken PLA and Belarusian troops were sharing their alcohol with one another and dancing in the streets to Belarusian and Chinese folk music, of which the Belarusian music sounded essentially the same as Russian music, with heavy emphasis on accordions, harmonicas, and mandolins. Of the latter instrument, it was a commonality as a fixture within Chinese music also, sometimes called a liu qin, which was a traditional Chinese pear-shaped mandolin. Other Chai-coms played their lutes and suonas and violins. Belarusian dancing resembled the Russian dancing commonly seen with the kicking and circular motions while so doing. The Chinese enjoyed themselves and danced alongside their allies, all with armor personnel carriers, infantry fighting vehicles, and main battle tanks sitting on the streets amid the rubble in the background, all as the men celebrated. Needless to say, of course, there were some troops within the vehicles, all still on guard duty, but now even they could generally relax. These guard troops within their vehicles now therefore sat in their drivers' and gunners' hatches enjoying a moderate quantity of drinks. They, therefore, sang themselves, all while watching their comrades dancing in the streets. Not all the troops, though, could revel away upon their tremendous victory just yet. Moreover, as some had minor patrol duties and watched the perimeters of the city, all for escapees among the former defenders trying to still escape, no doubt taking total advantage of the victory celebrations in order to try to successfully egress, all among the intoxication of the invasion now turned occupation forces. Private Lee, meanwhile, shared some bijou with the other members of his squad, except for 3 former members, one being deceased and 2 wounded in action, including one, Private Quing. He, being Private Lee's close friend, Private Quing who'd himself sustained a fairly bad brain injury during earlier combat, such occurring when the Type 63 armor personnel carrier took a direct side hit on the track from a 105mm recoilless anti-tank shell, all while he served as the turret gunner. As the celebrations went on into the night, they now continued on into Day 5's early hours, or essentially the first official day of occupation, post-victory of the Sino-Russian coalition's enormous invasion. Private Lee, soon to be Corporal Lee, would continue service within the PLA, serving honorably until being wounded in combat from a partisan grenade attack while on a dismounted patrol during his 3rd deployment in Pennsylvania. He would be on his 2nd deployment while stationed in California, which was basically for him an easy deployment. However, his 3rd such was a heavy one, for by the time of this, American partisans had become far tougher foes to vanquish, as their weapons, tactics, and overall experience had made them hard as stone. His FOB for his battalion at that time was outside of Philadelphia, and on patrols within the rolling hills with ample scattered woods and farmland there, he experienced savage combat with the partisans who dug in, who themselves rotated positions frequently so as to avoid air and artillery strikes levied upon their positions. Even so they did, many were annihilated when such strikes ruthlessly battered the land into moonscaped oblivion. Operations were conducted by the PLA quite often here to sweep areas looking for enemies. However, oftentimes these enemies simply hid during said sweeps or stayed a step ahead and thus avoided encirclements entirely. Not always, however, did they remain so blessed, as more often than was not the case, they were brutally picked apart, thereby being outright annihilated as a result. Corporal Lee, by the time of his 3rd and final deployment, was on the verge of receiving his sergeant promotion by that point. This, as he'd proven himself yet once more in savage combat operations within Philadelphia's urban streets, in addition to the rural countryside of Westchester and Lancaster counties, both fairly adjacent to the large metropolitan area that was Philadelphia. His forward operating base at the time was in Westchester County, fairly near southern Philadelphia. His mechanized infantry battalion had flushed out many insurgents from within the city, and in the more ruralized areas as well. These operations forcing the various partisan groups into a life of nomadism. After all, by this point, the once beautiful landscape of the area and the once world-famous Philadelphia itself, where the nation was essentially declared and born, was now nothing more than craters, ashes, and rubble. Once, where there had been skyscrapers, were now shortened husks of what they once had been, now shattered, ripped up skeletons of what once was the city's former skyline. This was largely due to mass carpet munitioning by Chi-Com PLAAF H-6Ks and Russian VVS Tu-22M strategic heavy bombers carried out at the outset of the invasion, and therefore hadn't ever been fully cleared or attempted to even be repaired as it related to the older buildings by the time of Lee's third deployment. Chinese colonial planning, however, called for rubble clearance and a new Sinofied city to be called Xi City No. 2. This, of course, hadn't yet been fully achieved due to the fighting still rampant there by this point. However, rubble clearance was still ongoing and nearly completed in many zones by year number 4 of occupation. Even so, there were multiple Laogai cities, practically, all established within the former city of Philadelphia, in order for many of its former residents and imported to the Gers to thereby rebuild the city in China's image, all carried out beneath the sharp brutality of the PAP guards in the despotic New China colony. Within many former cities of the land were their entire Laogai sub-camps. Many were initially transit Laogais, which then morphed into labor Laogais, all for the purpose of clearing the rubble to rebuild in China's image these very cities in which those sat. As of the moment, the city was mainly consisting of such concentration camps, intermixed with several stories tall newer buildings created of Chinese communist-style architecture. These buildings were essentially the barracks and administrative buildings. All of these put up in moderate numbers, albeit only really in the former city center. These areas within new colonial cities were what was called the red zones, in quotes, similar to fortified green zones, in quotes, in previous American wars of occupation. Now, China now began to do this to cities the whole land over. Be that as it were, warfare stymied the steady construction of the new colonial cities in many areas, although it didn't outright stop it. As though there were spread out newer buildings within these areas, products of Chinese construction. In slowing it all down, it therefore took more time to throw up buildings than it would in peacetime conditions. Of course, as China literally threw up entire ghost cities in relatively short order, as their construction workers built entire high-rises in literally several days at a time. As Xi City No. 2 was being built over the former Philadelphia, Mandarin street signs went up within it. all with central colonial urban planning calling for the new cities to thereby mimic the cities back home in China. This, in terms of both the architecture but also the propaganda and military and paramilitary oriented structures located throughout. Occasionally, there was combat within portions of the large metropolis whereby partisans hid in the underground areas only to emerge, carry out hit and run assaults, only then to disappear once more. Many Americans still fell during these skirmishes, including to the savage artillery counter-strikes or strikes from the air assets conducted by various different platforms of such. On the ground, the heavily armored PAP and PLA troops totally shredded partisans who were caught out in the open, all with very little problems while so doing. Even though the partisans lost many lives, they managed to become a real nuisance to the occupation forces. Similar in concept to being stung by hornets. It won't come quite close to killing you, but it'll hurt like hell. Such analogy applied to the partisans against the occupation forces. Corporal Lee had by this point in the war personally slaughtered many Americans in combat and was deeply troubled by it all. He being personally conflicted inside of his own mind and felt much guilt from it all. Though he never voiced his thoughts as a deeply introverted man, he had, in fact, classic PTSD symptoms from his several deployments by this point. Also, living within Red China, he had no freedom to voice his personal thoughts to anyone for fear of retribution or punishment, as in disciplinary paperwork upon him or fines, and even perhaps imprisonment coming from a potential court-martial. Of the latter, of course, depending on the level of the offense. He, Corporal Lee, by this time, was forced to engage American partisans many times over in combat by his third deployment. Private, now Corporal Lee, thereby lighting many enemies up from his crew-served turret weapons, or whenever utilized as a dismounted infantry soldier when on foot, with his QBZ-95 rifle. In addition to using his rifle, he'd gotten hand grenade kills, along with using a PF-97 thermobaric rocket once issued to him, this being used to blast an earthen bunker into absolute shit, likely eliminating many partisans within it in the process of so doing. Although when he utilized the PF-97, even during the battle damage assessment afterwards, no one could figure out the number of KIAs he caused due to the severe damage incurred by the bunker from his weapon. His second deployment in California had been largely quiet, with rarely any actual battles taking place. When there, he had mostly been on patrols and partook in guard force activities, with only several low-intensity skirmishes having had occurred. He had opened fire with his W-85 heavy machine gun while taking his position as the turret gunner on his Type 63 armor personnel carrier, thereby causing 5 confirmed KIAs, with other vehicles cutting down several other enemies as well, all causing the rest to flee as a result upon their breaking contact with the PLA troops. Otherwise, California was relatively calm during his time there, with the aforementioned ambush having been his most intense combat action while present there during that deployment. Of course, though, the first and third deployments were the most intense by far. One being due to their ferocity of invasion itself, and the other third deployment being caused from tougher, much better equipped remaining partisans with now better techniques to boot. His dismounted patrol, wherein his injuries occurred, was alongside a creek while walking on rocky ground alongside of a fairly wooded embankment. One that he and his company were patrolling while dismounted outside of their vehicles, then themselves being left on an adjacent road with drivers and gunners on watch. They'd assumed partisans might be close by, using such area as a potential water source or even a hunting area. Also, they sought out partisan earthen bunkers or cache sites to both destroy and also perhaps capture or kill their enemies on sight. Corporal Lee then led the troops of his squad beneath his sergeant to an area where existed a partisan's hiding spot. There indeed were cached away weapons in this area, along with several partisan fighters now in hiding, having had both heard and seen the Chi-Com vehicles while peering up from the embankment. This tiny grouping of partisans were a scouting element for a larger grouping, whose whole mission themselves was to inform the bigger group about Chi-Com troop movements within the area. Such being conducted so as to ensure that the larger group could possibly escape capture or total destruction. They had also with them a small cache of weapons, several Type 69 RPG tubes, with a dozen rockets of mixed anti-tank and anti-personnel varieties for such. Also, they had some Chinese QBZ-95 and 95B carbine rifles, with accompanying multiple magazines of ammunition, also an anti-tank mine. Even included within this cache of arms was a Russian SA-7 and a Chinese FN-6 man-portable air defense system, one of each type. These were a serious threat to lower-flying Chinese or other coalition aircraft of other remaining allies still occupying the land, along with the Chi-Coms. Of the two systems, the partisans likely acquired the SA-7 earlier in the war, now that the Russians had long since withdrawn to their new North American territories, they having had done their withdrawal 6 months into the occupation, thus leaving the lower 48 to head to the Arctic. Naturally, the FN-6 could have been captured at any point, as the Chi-Coms were the main occupying power. Corporal Lee's squad neared the partisans as they attempted to hide in their Earthen Creek embankment bunker site. He, upon nearing this cache bunker's entryway hole, had seen it and ordered 2 of his privates to be essentially tunnel rats in order to go in and clear it out. Upon this occurring, the now nearly discovered partisans, hearing the Chi-Coms and knowing they were basically caught, tossed out 3 frag grenades, one thrown by each man out of the hole. These were seen and caused many men to run and dive for cover. Many of the other squads made it away, but Lee's men were nearest to the partisan position, and several were blasted, thus maimed or KIA'd. 2 of the 10 indeed were KIAs. About 4 more were wounded in action. Private, now Corporal Lee, during this point in time, was badly wounded while running and attempting to dive away to safety. He was caught at an angle from how he moved while attempting to look back, this in order to ensure that his men were adequately moving. He had, of course, yelled commands to run and dive for the nearest cover to his men. Some men of his squad ran upwards successfully to higher ground above the embankment. This, as others were far less fortunate and didn't make it upwards and away fast enough. Corporal Lee tried to climb and dive safely to the ground above the embankment, although he didn't quite make it completely in so doing. Despite being badly injured, his reflex was to fire to cover the other men, this occurring as he'd fallen back down onto his back from climbing up the embankment merely several seconds earlier. He fired his QBZ-95 upon the hole, which, being the entrance to the tiny bunker in the embankment, now had rounds slapping the dirt just inside of it. This heavy fire levied through the hole caused the partisans inside to have to stay low, below the fire. Others in the squad, who were mildly or not at all injured, therefore did the same as Lee, or ran to render aid to those worst injured from the grenade attack. The fire into the hole was so heavy that the now trapped partisans could literally not even raise up, much less even lift their heads mere inches upwards. All as a hail of 5.8 by 42 millimeter rounds pelted the earthen walls of their tiny dug-in bunker right above them, all as they lay there now completely helpless. Be that as it were, they did give it their all, and even took a couple PLA troops with them. After all, they knew they themselves were, quote-unquote, out of there, therefore completely gone, finished, dead men. Eventually, Lee's injuries became too great for him to bear, and his suppressive fire on the partisan hole waned rapidly, all as others took over for him. His breathing became more and more difficult, even despite all the adrenaline pulsating through him, thereby having allowed him to temporarily continue fighting until he passed out from lack of proper breathing. Another squad in a staggered column formation behind his squad within the patrol ran to him and rendered emergency care, conducting aid via chest decompression and bandaging his wounds, also while radioing in for a medevac. All of this activity, from beginning to end, lasted merely only 5 minutes. Such being the case, as combat situations erupted and ended quickly, insofar as such instances were concerned. From the time of the grenade attack by the partisans, all until their demise coming from the PLA fire and counter-grenade attack, it was over quickly. Needless to say, the partisans all met their demise upon the PLA troops likewise throwing in a grenade upon having cooked it for a second before tossing it into the hole. Such had been done amid a temporary break in the suppressive fire levied upon the earthen dugout. This to allow one of the troops to get in beside the entry point to lob in their own horribly lethal fragmentation grenade. Upon it blasting, the whole dugout was wildly ruined and collapsed, with much of it having collapsed in on itself, not only from the grenade's blast, but also from the different munition types that were then present within the cache, which were inadvertently detonated by the sudden shrapnel strikes into them, which itself caused deadly reactions as a result. Needless to say, the partisans were peppered with shrapnel, shredded to hunks of gore and pieces of human meat. Other weapons inside the small primitive bunker were severely damaged and likewise shredded in pieces, thereby rendered unusable, of course. He and his fellow injured squad members, along with the two KIAs, would be removed from the battlefield as a Z-20 utility helicopter came to pick them up for the medevac. His injuries upon himself consisted of shrapnel wounds to his legs, arms, and a small amount embedded in his upper left side torso, which caused him a pneumothorax injury, the chest injury requiring chest decompression for his sucking chest wound from the piece that got him underneath his arm, where there was no armor protection present. Even so, he was treated by combat medics and sent via medevac by helicopter to a forward operating base military hospital where he received adequate trauma care for his injuries. He then, upon being stabilized, was sent home to China and then medically retired from the PLA. As was his friend, Private Quing, even sooner than at the latter time, as during the first initial invasion phase, he, succumbing to his head injuries, was likewise retired. Such injuries of Private Quing, of course, due to his brain damage sustained in his one and only tour of duty. This injury, therefore, having been sustained in brutal urban combat during the Cap City battle in the invasion phase itself. Quing was treated for his TBI and afterwards still had some problems with his motor skills and balance in general. Such was the toll war took on its participating combatants of all parties involved in the hostilities. Both men would receive their honors and decorations for helping to make literal history, and as a result, were lauded and seen as heroes in China, especially within their own communities upon returning from the war. For the time being, in the meantime, returning back to late Day 4 of the invasion itself, however, the then Pvt Li was convinced, finally, to join in with the victory celebrations now unfolding within the vanquished land, all throughout it, even with he himself right in the very heart of it all, present currently inside the enemy's former Cap City itself. He had himself some baijiu with the others and caught himself a decent buzz. Enjoying victory, upon being convinced, actually set in, thereby making him feel a sense of euphoria as a result of such. However, he was introverted to the point where it often took outsiders to put him back on track, whenever it pertained to any unfolding current situations. Oftentimes, Pvt Li was stuck deep within his own thoughts. He picked up this trait as his mind was the only private place where he himself could retreat to. This, as living within a strict totalitarian regime, meant he could not speak freely, nor could he express his true ideas and how he actually felt about various issues. He had to be a robot for the CCP regime. However, that didn't mean he didn't feel guilt, regret, sorrow, or doubt, or any number of different things that would be frowned upon by the regime within which he served. He was bound to Chinese communism and not permitted, therefore, to step out of line. As it was indeed a line he was forever forced to proverbially toe. So he drank, and it helped him feel better, albeit only temporarily. After all, he fought hard for the victory, so he gave in to the new feelings of erstwhile euphoria, now that he was free of his recently previous thoughts, often being conflicted within his own mind over various matters, including his own personal guilt. Meanwhile, as it was late day 4, before the turn of day number 5 of the overall foreign intervention, Sgt Richardson had been hiding inside the city's underground, within the virtual labyrinth of sewers, maintenance tunnels, subway lines of the metro, and a whole myriad of basements, and even sub-basements that were connected to all the aforementioned. It was here where the grouping of what now was 4 total men, now down from 5, as one had been lost, as it was these men who had escaped barely into the sewers with their lives, upon just having had made it in, and were now in hiding as a result. When they outran by just a proverbial hair the advancing Belarusian armored battalion, they narrowly dodged hand grenades tossed down and into the sewer manhole covering after them, then being opened from use by many attempting escape away from the ruthless battlefield above. Others had earlier fled in this manner as well, running away from the then collapsing defenses of the then third and final defense line, which fell apart completely early on day number 4. Now, as Sgt Richardson, Staff Sergeant Roberts, and the 2 other remaining men, both buck sergeants or E5s like Sgt Richardson, they tried to formulate a real feasible means of evasion to flee the area. They tried at first, late on day 4, as it was now dark, to flee downriver, floating upon pieces of now multiple floating driftwood. This failed, as one of the 2 other men, by a drainage opening along the Potomac from the drainage tunnels where rainwater emptied into the river from the streets, himself got onto one such floating board within the dark of night. Thus, as he began to float away, he had been spotted by a quadcopter drone, itself having been launched by a squad on local patrols of an area adjacent to the Potomac. These occurring above and along the local river walk within the immediate area, from where the men had by that point attempted escape. These troops had a light machine gun, a QJY-88, which totally wasted the man in the water, as his body, now shot up multiple times, could be seen from within the drainage pipe where the other men now sat. The man, now eliminated, began now sinking underwater, as the current slowly dragged his body, now full of holes, away and beneath the surface of the river. He wore his IBA, his body armor, which, without holding onto the driftwood, had thus made him sink all the more rapidly. It was apparent that the Chi-Com troops were using armor-piercing 5.8 by 42 millimeter rounds, of which these were well established when it came to defeating ceramic SAPI plates, including within the Kevlar vests themselves. It came as a nasty surprise to the men now hiding within the drainage pipe, as they witnessed this all through their night vision goggles. Likewise had the Chi-Com drone and the troops themselves, likewise having initially spotted the now KIA'd American sergeant with their drone's infrared camera connecting to a handheld screen held by one of the soldiers. Also through the NVGs of the PLA troops themselves from their helmet mounts as well. He had then been fired upon by multiple QBZ-95 rifles as well as the QYJ-88 light machine gun. After this brutal response had occurred upon the man attempting his escape, the three men still remaining in the drainage tunnel looking out toward the Potomac now fled back down the drainage system from whence they'd come, all in order to try to escape, albeit via new plans. Now they needed such a new plan as already were there two PLA mechanized infantry battalions retasked as underground assault forces, these being utilized to clear out the city's metro system, drainage, sewers, and tunnels of various sorts of whatever specific remaining holdouts tried, therefore in order to hide or to escape the clutches of the PLA. There, of course, was a vigorously tight outer cordon around all major exits from the city to screen all civilians now moving about after the battle in order to catch former troops or other similar former American security forces having had previously defended the city from their invasion. We can't escape, it looks like. At least not through the river, stated the other remaining sergeant to Sgt Richardson and Staff Sergeant Roberts. Yeah, we damn sure don't want to end up like the other man we just lost did. We need to think of something else, and fast, added Staff Sergeant Roberts as he tried to brainstorm a potential way out, this time via renewed creativity. The men now discussed this and tried avidly to come up with a new idea for escape, and one that was realistic and had a real chance of success. Thinking and arguing ensued, albeit not a heated argument, but the debating, rather, over the different ideas coming up. As all of this occurred, other people were moving throughout the underground area, seemingly in a panic, but even so, yet others moved with a real purpose, like they were deliberately going somewhere. Observing all of this, Sgt Richardson actually stopped and asked someone what was going on, where they had come from. Well, the PLA says it's over, topside, but they're looking for American fighting men, and they're somewhat showing some goodwill towards the civilian population, especially the elderly, who seem to have an easier time passing through areas of the city. Apparently, the Chi-Coms respect the elderly, at least judging by their conduct. That seems to be the case. What do you mean exactly? Inquired Sgt Richardson, now with interest and curiosity piqued by this description of the overall situation now at hand. Yeah, they're not really all that concerned about the city's remaining population now that the fighting is basically now over with. They're essentially filtering all the civilians out of the underground, those who survived down here as refugees from the fighting throughout the battle occurring above. I'm in these civilian clothes, as I had ditched my uniform because they're patting down civilians. They're now looking for any weapons, and military-aged males especially. They scrutinize the military-aged males. Some they take and apprehend, while others they actually cut loose. Hard to tell, but that's what I've been told a few hours ago. And more than just a few times. It sounds to be true, but I'm trying to do this right, then added the passerby to Sergeant Richardson and the others. What do you mean by do this right? Asked Sergeant Richardson. Yeah, basically, I'm trying to score some gray hair dye and pass myself off as a 50 or 60 something year old man. Think about it. Who the hell has hoarded any hair dye during this invasion so far? No one, that's who. And guess what? I'm gonna sneak up there through a manhole and check the rubble of a pharmacy that I recall that was on a specific street, up there before the artillery smashed the whole area to pieces, responded the man, sounding fairly sure of himself towards the end, before then stating, yeah, I'm gonna get out of the city by doing it that way. Sergeant Richardson then thought about it and then said, can we come with you? That's a damn good idea. And it actually might even work, now that I really think about it. At least if what you say is even true. Hell, it can't hurt, interjected Staff Sergeant Roberts, with the other remaining sergeant of the original group with them nodding in approval at the idea. After all, it was the most realistic means by this point by which to escape. That is, considering the revelry above ground by that point, and the leniency being shown by the victors to the defeated civilian population. So far, that was the case for the time being, but it wouldn't stay that way. All as later, that local population within the city still lingering would then be enslaved and thereby put to work. But taking a large urban population and sorting and collecting them, identifying and housing them, would be a large project that was, according to pre-drawn up CCP plans, to occur over the course of about a week or so. Certainly record time to carry out such a task throughout the land's major urban areas, thus having been defeated. Some areas would immediately break out into continued combat as some such major and even smaller urban areas erupted into all-out partisan uprisings en masse, while some others, like the cap city of the vanquished nation, would be easily subdued and therefore acquiesce to their slavery at the hands of their new colonial masters. However, other cities would see mixed results, with red zones being portions of cities that were quote-unquote secure, so to speak, for the occupation forces and newly arriving colonists, all while fighting and counterinsurgency warfare raged just beyond the walls of such said areas. As of the local immediate area, the entire former national cap city would itself be entirely a large red zone, and as such would serve as the colonial capital of the Chinese occupation as a whole. Other cities serving as local capitals of occupation colonial zones and regions would be fought over throughout a longer time of the occupation. Over time, unfortunately for the Americans, they'd lose in the cities largely, losing giant swathes of the population, fighting and dying within them. But would instead end up growing a stronger hand out in the countryside during the meantime, wherein they'd actually have a real chance to make the occupying forces bleed over time. At least such was the case once better weapons, tactics, and means of primitive organization, communication, and thus coordination were acquired and learned, with the knowledge applied to real-life conditions over the course of time. The men now followed the man who was dressed in civilian clothing, also himself a former defender in the city, to the top side via an open manhole cover. All being done to scour the area for the devastated pharmacy building and for the hair dye within. Staff Sergeant Roberts and Sergeant Richardson, the other sergeant as well, and the man in civilian clothing leading the way, were all for the time being still armed. Even the man wearing the slacks and button-down white shirt with the pencil pockets was armed with his former duty weapon, a UMP-40 submachine gun. He identified himself as a former member of one of the alphabet paramilitary elements who aided in the city's defense. He was in his SWAT gear along with all the others during that time to fight the battle, but then disrobed such when the defeat had occurred. It had truly been all hands on deck during the invasion, and all weapons on deck as well, even by the time it was all over and done with. Now they proceeded through smashed buildings amid their rubble piles stacked many feet tall, consisting of everything from brick, concrete, metal beams, plaster and wood, and more, as countless pieces of furniture and personal belongings and additional items were now scattered and shredded everywhere, in likewise countless pieces. There was in some areas ways to hide within the rubbled and smashed buildings, as inside of the giant rubble piles were some areas like miniature tunnels inside of it all. Of these, which occasionally worked and safely led past plenty of areas, or at the least ended up with openings atop of even more piles of rubble. Of course, the men had to travel this way to avoid being outright spotted by enemy forces. It was eerie for sure, as there were corpses and body parts strewn about, and in between the rubble itself. Many had perished en masse throughout the savagely violent onslaught upon the city, and of course, everywhere else in general throughout the land. Now, after having hidden and traversed through all the rubble, even past groupings of enemy troops, now drunk and dancing to music throughout the streets, even beside their vehicles, the men found a massively gutted former three-story building. Or it was at one time such, at least. Now, all that remained of it was only parts of the first floor's facade, with the second and third floors smashed in, and even laying around the outside of the remaining facade's entryway piece left barely standing. That was indeed the pharmacy spoken of by the passing man currently in their present company. It was now dark, and the men all wore night vision goggles just to be safe. No official patrols present, just drunken troops all up and down the streets, with the nearest grouping of them about 50 to 70 meters away, perhaps. Loud, boisterous, and obnoxious acting as these troops were, the men had a real chance to get into the gutted structure and search very briefly, at a bare minimum, for their hoped-for items. They indeed hoped something would still be in there, present within the rubbled building. All of them taking an area to themselves behind the low-standing remains of the facade piece of the building's first floor, and now searched avidly for the gray hair dye, as presently there were literal shredded items and crushed items, with even some that miraculously were still somehow in one piece amid all the rest of the ruination now present. Albeit, though nothing was totally unscathed from the damage of the invasion. Even the items not totally destroyed were covered in dust and dented beyond anything appearing even a little bit decent. Nonetheless, there were some badly dented food cans, and the hungry men took of them in order to have food to eat later. Some drinks even, too, remained intact, at least just barely. Of those, 2 were found consumable still. They finally found some personal care items, which were ripped up and scattered about, but there were some aspects of them still usable. Despite such, the men only wanted one thing: gray hair dye. Finally, after about 15 good minutes of the 4 of them searching frantically, they found it. One package, of which had its cardboard box shredded, with the container inside slightly cut, but it still contained the liquid itself. The men agreed to share it as they returned extremely cautiously through all of the rubbled remains of what once had been buildings, while on their return trip, re-entry through the sewers was a hazard, to be sure, as 2 battalions of Chi-Com PLA troops were thoroughly still moving through, thereby searching for men such as they, these being former enemy combatants hiding amid the civilian population now being filtered out gradually from the underground. This being methodically carried out now that the victory was claimed and the fighting concluded. Many of these civilians did not yet know that the victors had evil, despotic, ruthless ambitions towards them, and would act upon their preconceived plans a bit later. For now, though, it was all about the capture of former regime elements and their security forces to be thereby filtered out of the civilian populations, which itself took precedence over the formal enslavement of the area's urban population, which was to begin in earnest a bit later. After all, the sheer magnitude of the monumental task of consolidation over the vast landmass and its myriad of people would indeed take some time. Temporarily allowing certain groups of urban populations to move about somewhat didn't harm the overall endgame of later herding and capturing the overall population as a whole. This, due to even those who moved on foot to other areas, would just become the responsibility of simply whichever units lay therein within the specific AOs that they ended up in, only then to seize these civilians and capture them within said AOs. These mobile civilians moving to other AOs within which they ended up were to be captured when the time came to begin to nab the civilian populations en masse. These gigantic consolidation operations of the new colony of New China would therefore need to occur in specific phases, as these objectives required the specific allocation and redirection of immense personnel, time, and resources in order to achieve. As such, roundups of civilians would soon rapidly ensue in earnest when most of the surrendering organized American former regime forces were taken captive by and large. Then would the mass roundups operations begin shortly thereafter, within a 1 to 2 day amount of time. For now, the civilians leaving the underground from whence they'd taken cover earlier would witness the revelry and victory celebrations of the enemy occupation troops and would watch as Chi-Com imagery covered what little tiny bit even remained intact of their former city. It was glum and sad for the civilian non-combatants, facing a miserable existence under occupation and cruel colonization by their new masters. But what was worse would be the Laogai system faced by POWs, who would face hard labor for the crime of simply defending their own nation. Of course, it went without saying that the CCP would treat the leadership very much the same. They didn't differentiate between enemy troops and the ruling class, and would give them equally miserable treatment within the Laogais. Of course, under their AI categorization programming system. Now, the 4 men vigorously dyed their hair, trying to share the meager package with its small amount of liquid still remaining within. It seemed to work, as the 4 men now all had hair wear upon their heads, all of which that made them to appear at least 20 years older than what they actually were, as it had turned gray. They managed to even find a woman who, within her bag, had a mirror from which the men were able to view their new appearance. They, now satisfied, grabbed sticks or pipes laying around the underground tunnels to use as makeshift canes. They now had to improvise, due, of course, to the situation now developing. It all helped to be certain that indeed the Chi-Coms had been drinking, many of them heavily so. However, others actually tasked out for security missions may have had to sneak their drinks but weren't outright wasted. Being that this was total victory over China's sworn enemy, it was a very special occasion, essentially meaning activities occurred which may not have been formally condoned during ordinary times. However, there were still enough level-headed troops to where the threat of discovery, capture, or elimination remained a very real and constant peril for the Americans, even despite whatever else was now occurring with the celebrations. After waiting behind other civilians in a subway station entrance, there was a queue which had formed up. The men now having ditched their formerly issued service weapons, albeit doing so very reluctantly, due to gambling literally everything on their current role they were playing. This group now passed by PLA troops walking around on the outskirts of the lines forming near the metro subway station exits below ground. They were patrolling up and down the subway tunnel on 100-meter walking patrols moving back and forth, all occurring while a portable speaker played over and over again the now former American Secretary of State's official surrender message and capitulation speech. It was all so surreal and demoralizing, hearing and seeing it all unfolding. The people, now all queued up in line, were standing there like dumb sheep, as if being guided to their proverbial slaughter, which, in a way, was sort of true, as, after all, a bit later, they would be placed in massive transit laogais upon first being collected and sorted before being sent to China later, or even sent to death camps for grisly organ harvesting procedures upon being first beheaded in industrial-sized human butcher shops. Preferably speaking, the fortunate ones would either go to American labor laogais and work alongside we to the Gers brought in from China to help with colonization-related work, or to be sent to Chinese laogais in their own country to produce products, mine various minerals, and work different construction-related jobs. The very most blessed among these would be they who are taken in by wealthy Chinamen, including CCP party elites, to serve as their house slaves. In the meantime, they wouldn't be told of their collective fates, at least not by the PLA forces currently present. However, the PAP was already on top of it, in terms of the formal persecution and atrocities, and with great glee carried out the will of the party in the most cruel and medieval forms. Now the line in the tunnel moved forward ever so gradually. Minutes elapsed, and finally they made it to an inner checkpoint manned by Chi-Com PLA troops at a makeshift booth, constructed out of sandbags from recent American defenses and rubble from laying literally everywhere all around them. They had a soldier with his light machine gun sitting on a small wooden box with his weapon propped up by its bipod, now folded out from beneath it, laying atop the sandbags in rubble position. The other PLA soldiers had their rifles at the low ready, always vigilant for any potential issues, such as the line filed past them, with facial expressions depicting their sheer resolve, as if thinking to themselves, if you act proper, we will act the same as well. But at the same time, don't try us or else you're finished, as a sort of line of thinking, so to speak. One could simply tell just by looking at them, and the four men knew that particular line of thinking as well, as being former security forces personnel themselves. They kept on walking, edging through past the squad now manning the ad hoc checkpoint / booth-like area. This decorated with recently slapped up Xi posters behind it, adjacent on the walls of the tunnel. Beyond them stood another squad by the steps leading up and out of the metro station to the surface. There were two men with their rifles slung over their backs behind them, who were tasked with searching these civilians walking through their particular area by the steps going up. The other 8 men of the 10-man dismount squad of mechanized infantry now tasked out down here in the tunnels, were holding their QBZ-95s and one with a QJY-88 light machine gun all at the low ready, in case of any trouble. Finally, upon reaching the steps, with their pipes and sticks posing as ad hoc canes, and their gray hair wearing their civilian attire, they were now patted down, though not checked for documents. It was very fortunate that it was strictly for weapons and nothing else at this point. All the men forgot to ditch their military or agency ID cards, as it related in the case of the former Alphabet Man and the 3 soldiers too. The slightly buzzed PLA troops, though still fairly level-headed, albeit ever so mildly forgetful, then looked them over once after searching them for weapons, thus finding none, now allowing them to proceed up the steps to leave the tunnel, as the others in line prior had done, ahead of them a bit earlier. They walked up the stairs to the top of the metro station's entrance to find the city had already been hastily redecorated. There were symbols of the Red Chinese CCP and its comrade emperor for life, Xi, all over the remains of the city. Red banners hung on all manner of the very scant few still standing buildings, along with Chinese national flags with CCP party flags too. The Xi posters were on what tiny few remaining facade pieces of gutted large buildings still stood as well, along with even amid some rubble stacked in a way where a poster could still even be slapped upon it. It was like another universe when compared with what it had once been just merely days prior. Symbols of the former regime were now made in China's image and likeness, thereby adorned and redecorated CCP style, this with the aforementioned decorations. The former American monuments even had a massive 30 by 50 foot large oil paintings of Xi stood up in front of them. There was one facing the mall on the west-facing portion of the cap structure, along with one on the Lincoln Memorial, also facing inwards to the east towards the ruined, dug-up and cratered mall from all the recent combat. Also, one in front of the former presidential residence as well, facing the ellipse. This, for all to see, their new ruler. Amongst these signs of Chinese domination and victory were portable generator-powered plasma TV screens steadily broadcasting CCP propaganda non-stop, in both Mandarin and dubbed in English as well, within an alternating format. Obviously, such was intended to demoralize the already vanquished land. Furthermore, even in addition to all that had already thus occurred, through its crushing defeat, it was now New China, and the CCP wanted everyone to know it and to even feel it. PLA presence was everywhere in the streets as they imbibed and celebrated their famous victory and establishment of their long-time dream now come true, colonizing much of the North American continent to make China completely food and largely even resource independent to boot. China, after all, was a $24 trillion economy that sat upon 35 trillion worth of natural resources. If using the USD as a metric for judging such. America, when it was a nation previously, whose contracting, shriveling economy of now 12 trillion had existed, it had sat upon an estimated 45 to 50 trillion worth of natural resources. Of course, Russia, who had their own plans in all of this, was a $5 trillion economy, which sat on $75 trillion of massive natural resources. Now, with the rest of the Arctic Sea currently beneath Russian rule, it was about to see an enormous increase. As China and Russia both split the 45 to 50 trillion worth of American resources between them, along with those enormous natural resources of Canada as well. Canada, in all of this, was now just a rump puppet state, nominally independent, but in reality beneath Chinese rule, with a puppet regime installed over the rump bottom provinces of Canada. Canada now losing the top 3 Arctic territories of Yukon, Nunavut, and Northwest Territories, which therefore were ceded over formally to Russia. These now becoming part of the Neo-USSR, or New Russian Empire Rebuilt, which now spanned 3 entire continents, as it had once before, when it possessed Alaska over 100 years prior. Now, it was back, and with a vengeance, along with China, who really came and collected, in quotes, as they say, on what it felt it was owed. Now, the top 2 strongest nations on the face of the earth, with China as the supreme superpower and hegemon, and Russia a true resource superpower, owning the Arctic Sea, were those who made the rules in this world. Certainly, there were other large powers, but what China and even Russia said was now the law. Russia would grow exceedingly wealthy beyond all imagination, as they'd exploit and sell their Arctic resources to all the nations of the world. China, for its part, was now food independent, although a large uprising would mushroom and get out of hand. But also they too began to exploit the natural resources of their land to boot, including its people, which is what would really make the partisans grow in number over time: the fear of enslavement. The men, now seeing the city turn red, were feeling extremely awkward, like the rest of the American citizens, unsure of what lay ahead of them, what their lives would even be, or just even literally be overall, even in general terms, beneath the occupation regime as it stood. The men, now feeling naked without their weapons, had to settle for it, as it was the only way out of this city, possibly. They risked everything on this plan, and God willing, literally, it would somehow work. They walked slowly and observed their surroundings, Gaining vital situational awareness, they watched the PLA Chi-Coms dance and drink along with their Belarusian allies. There were Pakistani troops also, though themselves not drinking. But some, seen by the men, now smoked hookah tobacco from a hookah they'd brought along with them. Others played sitars and different types of flutes, as the sounds of 3 different nations' music permeated throughout the air. It sounded like victory, but stung like defeat for sure, felt avidly by the losing side. The men felt crushed inside, but still knew it wasn't completely over, and sought an escape to the wilderness to do as the sergeant major told them at their final messenger formation, to go out, evacuate, and raise up partisan groups of their very own, or to join others. That was precisely what the 4 men intended on so doing. Passing more groups of dancing troops, they pretended to use their canes, keeping a slow pace, playing their role as old men, their chosen role that they decided they had to play. At one point, a PLA soldier, drunk, grabbed one of the men and said something in slurred Mandarin before another PLA soldier grabbed him and pulled him back. He actually looked back apologetically, as if trying to appear sorry for his friend's behavior while drunk. It was such a strange time and place to be alive, indeed, as the men kept moving while trying to avoid any close contact with the wasted troops of the 3 different armies, albeit minus those of the Pakistani forces who tended not to drink, and if they did, they were sneaking it illegally. Word had it, when underground, that Russians had passed by through the city from the south, apparently from Richmond. Someone said it, but didn't know if it was true or not. Apparently, the Russians kept moving north before headed northwest to Fort Detrick to seize a large portion of the now former American nation's biowarfare program to bring back to Russia. Everything now was up for grabs to whomever got there first. Nobody, of course, on the American side really knew much of anything of what now went on within their land. Nor did they know the details, even if they had ideas or heard vague things somehow through the proverbial grapevine. Needless to say, it was all over, and such had been rung in like a communist version of New Year's, including some PLA troops firing off their QBZ-95s into the air, and officers or support troops firing off their QSZ-92 pistols. This as 5.8 by 42 millimeter rifle ammo and 5.8 by 21 millimeter pistol rounds now filled the air. They had to land somewhere, but fell largely on the literal thousands of different rubble piles now comprising what had once been the city. There was one such group ahead, as the men kept moving forward now, and to the south, away from the mall. They were trying to cross one of the few intact remaining several street bridges within the area, near where the messenger men had worked by the Jefferson Memorial DOD headquarters, at least erstwhile headquarters at that time. The bridge adjacent to it had been held firm for a while by a bridgehead of American forces on the other side, of nearly 700 men at the time of the battle occurring, many of whom the Pakistani army troops of the 17th Lancers Regiment had totally hacked to pieces, both literally and figuratively speaking, as they put immense pressure upon the southern part of the regime quarter by the end of day number 2, until early day number 4, when the regime officially surrendered. Now, getting there and across would be the literal best way out of the city. Of the 3 armies present, the Pakistani forces seemed at least not not be as thorough as were the Chi-Coms and Belarusians, who didn't half-ass anything and were very by the book in the sense of military procedures. Not that the Pakistani army wasn't an outstanding fighting force. Indeed, they were superb and experienced in combat, well seasoned from fighting border skirmishes over the years. No, rather, it was that 2 types of soldiers existed: garrison soldiers and field soldiers. Considering the 2, the best were obviously a blend of both, but sometimes you had entire forces that were mostly one or the other. Pakistani troops were excellent field soldiers, warriors in combat. When it came to procedures, including management of conquered areas, they were not as proficient in securing gains as were their allies, predominantly the Chinese, but also the Russians, Belarusians, and North Koreans. Other allies involved, including even Iran and Cuba, weren't as strict as were the aforementioned either, and thus were more like the Pakistani army was in that sense. Now, as the men nearly reached the bridge by the now pelted, pockmarked to hell Jefferson Memorial, they could see the massive piles of corpses of American dead piled up now everywhere, just heaped on without any consideration, to be burned later. There was really no other sanitary way to dispose of that many corpses, besides using flamethrowers and gasoline upon them to ensure they turned quickly to ash, all to prevent totally preventable diseases. There also were Chi-Com PLA troops guarding the bridge, with a sign in 4 languages. 3 of the occupiers, with one in English, that said, "You are now leaving Chinese sector, entering Pakistani sector." All the men seen it and read it as they approached the PLA troops. Immediately, there were QBZ-95s raised up upon the unarmed men, who by necessity and choice earlier had disarmed themselves to play their new role as old men. "Stop!" came a loud, snappy order in English. Then Mandarin was spoken among the troops, who continued to raise their weapons at the 4 men, who appeared elderly. Their squad sergeant was obviously wasted, as he hardly could aim his rifle straight. So he cursed in Mandarin and set it down instead of slinging it, to pull his pistol out instead. His QSZ-92 then came out of his holster and aimed it at the men menacingly, albeit with his arms swerving. The corporal below him in rank, within the squad, was relatively more sober and said in English, "Come here, men. You all look old and tired. Let's check you, and you'll all be on your way. I remember my grandfather back in China. He just passed away 2 years ago." Upon the corporal saying this, he lifted his left arm off of supporting his rifle and did a wave low towards the ground for the other privates to return their rifles to the low ready position from aiming them. They did so upon his silent command. Their drunken sergeant, who also spoke English, must have had something click mentally at what the corporal said, and thereby chose to lower his pistol also. and even asked the four men to stay and drink with them, thereby going from aggression to hospitality. Proceeding forward silently and nervously, thereby unsure what the PLA troops might do to them, tried not to show fear or any sense of hiding anything. Finally, moving up to the squad's corporal then said, "Private Lee, check these men. If everything is in order, you can send them on their way. These are just old men. Should be nothing to worry about. We're looking for enemy troops for now, so they can go when your search is complete," ordered the corporal in English, to where not only the Americans understood, but as would the other soldiers of the squad who lived here as Trojan shock armies and knew either broken basic English, went out on weekend liberty before the war, or they became very proficient like Private Lee. His corporal and sergeant over the squad. Private Quing had been proficient, but he was in a military hospital due to his head trauma, undergoing MRIs and CT scans to check for cranial hemorrhaging and other abnormalities, along with X-rays for the bones. The latter, despite his helmet and armor largely having saved his bones from outright breaking from smacking up and into such metal when the vehicle had been hit. Now the men kept their rifles at the low ready, with some taking short swigs from the liquor bottle of baijiu being passed around. Private Lee was all business. He'd been guarding the bridge now for several hours, thereby relieving another squad to go off to sightsee, drink, dance, and enjoy the victory celebrations in the city center. He patted the men down, and they appeared deeply worried and concerned. They sure did their damnedest not to even show their worry. They knew they still had identifying documents upon them. They prayed prayers in their minds, hoping that it wouldn't be found or milled right over somehow, some way. Private Lee could see the looks of inner tension on the faces of the men while he patted them down. As an aside, Private Lee never had any personal issues with the American people, as from the very beginning, he enjoyed their cities before they were totally and completely leveled and razed to the ground. No, Private Lee had fun on his weekend liberties before the invasion, though he never cheated with American women on his wife back home. He would talk to them in bars, but could never tell them who he really was due to OPSEC or operational security concerns, as relationships beyond sexual encounters, essentially one-night stands, were highly frowned upon by the PLA and CCP above them, due to the potential of compromising their already somewhat open secret back home of Trojan shock army deployments. At least in China, it was an open secret, but the vast majority of Americans hadn't a single clue about it and knew nothing of it, at least until it was far, far too late, and right over top of them, upon them. Now he lamented having to outright slaughter Americans in their own land. He only did it because he had to as part of his job, his duty as a PLA soldier. He did that, but wanted nothing beyond that. He wasn't a savage like the thugs in the PAP, as he once had thought, thinking their job to be messy in his own mind. He would never dare speak his innermost opinions out loud, as he served a despotic regime that would punish him for even thinking such things. So, having kept his mouth shut, he was steadily facing inner conflict and turmoil himself, and had to be snapped out of his introverted nature by those in his presence many multiple times over. His corporal, sergeant, and even fellow brothers in arms, the young and goofy Private Quing being one of them, helped to keep him on track, as his mind wandered often. He felt, in fact, that he'd killed enough Americans and thought it unnecessary to harm any more now that victory had been attained. Unfortunately for Private Lee, a new phase was coming, and he would be forced to do it again and again and again against his own will and desires. He served the will of the almighty state, the CCP regime. He was but a cog in the wheel of the great red dragon. How could one man defy the will of the state, the momentum of history itself, the mightiest nation upon the face of the whole earth? What could he do to stop all of this? Nothing but be swept away by it all, and be another blind order follower who shut off his conscience to kill more and more out of the necessity of warfare. He thought he was done with it all, but Private Lee, soon to be Corporal Lee, wasn't in fact done. He desired to be back home in China with his family, and no longer present here. He'd already made history, and wanted that to legitimately be it, in quotes, to be through with it all. Therefore, when he witnessed the inner tension upon the very faces of these scared-looking American men, who appeared elderly and worn out, at least according to first sight, Private Lee felt sympathy and empathy for them, and did the one thing he thought he could do to try to make things right, at least in his own mind. As he searched the men, and thereby pulled out first Sgt Richardson's wallet containing his U.S. Army military ID card, he looked at it and at Sgt Richardson in his half-ass but passable old man disguise. Fortunately for the 4 American men, Private Lee was the only one who could see any paperwork or ID cards from his vantage point, as some of the other privates stood behind the 4 men for tactical reasons. This, in case those being searched chose to get froggy, so to speak. Such was done to where all Private Lee, in response, would literally need to do if they resisted, would be to throw them down on the ground and off to the side, whereas a result of any resistance against being thereby searched, they could then easily be butchered by the other troops of the squad in response. He gave him back his wallet and looked at Sgt Richardson straight in the eyes. And for 5 seconds, that felt like an eternity as the men stared at one another with the legitimate fear at Private Lee having had seen his American military ID card. But then came in response from Private Lee, "I miss my grandfather too. back in China. Just like Corporal Jing over there says. We are just people like you. I know you're old, and we are sorry to inconvenience you all here. In China, we have great respect for our elders, said Private Li, fully having caught Sgt Richardson, and therefore the others, but he chose to play along. Strange things happen in wars throughout history. Sometimes some of the combatants take pity upon the other side and even permit certain things, or allow them to proverbially slide, as it were. World War II at its end seen many such instances as Germany fell to the Allies. History rhymes at times, and Private Li, with a straight face and a few drinks in him lowering his inhibitions while not making him fully drunk, and flush with his inner turmoil of personal thoughts and feelings about everything occurring, chose to be merciful upon his defeated enemy, at least this one time. Private Li, the merciful. He forgot for a moment he was a soldier, and chose instead to be a human being in this particular instance. He then searched the other men. Once Sgt Richardson looked at them and gave a coy, light shrug of being confused when looking at the other Americans. Sgt Richardson didn't understand the blessing God literally had bestowed upon him. Even could have been classified as a miracle. Perhaps God put Private Li at the right place, right time, right mood, right everything for Sgt Richardson and the other 3 men to be able to escape safely. After finishing with the last man, Private Li looked up at the sergeant, who by now was laying passed out drunk on top of the armor personnel carrier, having drank himself into a stupor. The corporal, in a more clear-headed state, took over for the sergeant, and thus handled the radio when required, and took one for the team in regards to the sergeant who couldn't control himself and his drinking, and thereby drank himself unconscious. Private Li and the other privates of the squad, even the corporal, who wasn't a complete prick to the American men, waved at them as they left to cross the bridge into Pakistani-occupied Arlington, then Alexandria, as they planned on moving on and out of the entire city were it still possible. Needless to say, after this close call, they all tossed their ID cards and any other identification into the Potomac off the bridge. They sure didn't really need it anymore, as the nation was defunct. It didn't exist anymore. It could have gotten them killed or captured otherwise, had God not intervened for them. It was something at first each figured they'd need to show other Americans as proof of who they were, even beyond the city, once they escaped. This, of course, was faulty thinking, as no one cared anymore about that, except the invaders, in order to classify and detain people for slavery in laogais or organ harvesting death camps. They proceeded now through the Pakistani-occupied areas of the city, as this was the side their forces had a direct hand in overtaking. And they did so quite well and effectively during the invasion. Their vehicles, either Chinese supplied or built under license in the Chinese constructed military armaments plants within Pakistan, were present all over the city. All their troops were playing instruments or smoking on hookahs or simple tobacco pipes and drinking chai tea. They seemed thrilled at their victory, and fortunately for the time being, didn't seem to give a rat's ass about the civilian population, at least for now. They weren't cruel towards them, just indifferent and ambivalent. They just looked at the curious, now wondering, aimless, stunned American people coming out from hiding to see the foreign troops in total control over their land. The Pakistani troops seemed as if they were in a zoo visiting, looking at exotic creatures by how their soldiers pointed, chuckled, and laughed and spoke amongst themselves, while in a celebratory, jubilant mood over the victory. They stood by and did their thing, only interacting with the locals when absolutely necessary, but largely kept to themselves. They watched for troublemakers, like former defenders who made themselves obvious. However, they mostly didn't care all that much, or at least they didn't seem to. They only did what they were ordered to do, and for the moment, that was to enjoy themselves and their victory, but likewise be vigilant for any escaping enemy personnel from the previous battle. Thus, seeing none, they did their proverbial thing and partied the night away. Sergeant Richardson, Staff Sergeant Roberts, and the other sergeant, an alphabet paramilitary man, all decided to part ways. They all had set upon places they intended to go to leave the city. Of the group, the other sergeant had family close by who he wanted to see if they somehow managed to even survive, and if they were even alive in general, and made it through the invasion. It was well understood by now that many millions of Americans were violently snuffed out within merely 4 total days. By that point, as it was day number 5 officially now, the men moved and kept on going, with the alphabet man leaving. Soon thereafter, the other sergeant left himself. He had his own people he was out to find, and had his own plans to begin with, and simply went along with the other men out of convenience. Now it was just Sergeant Richardson and Staff Sergeant Roberts who spoke among themselves now. "Welp, they're gone now. Guess it's just us. Gotta keep playing the old geezer card until we can get the hell out of here and get something together and find weapons again," stated Sergeant Richardson to Staff Sergeant Roberts as they walked past strewn rubble throughout the canyons of rubble piles that had once been buildings and homes. Walking by now, many hundreds of civilians just emerging into their new world, reality, and life as it now was, taking it all in. Some simply couldn't handle it all, and just cracked up there in the middle of the streets. Many Americans had been arrogant, ignorant, unprepared, lazy, very complacent, and had a total false sense of security, failing to realize how weak in actuality that their nation had now become. Rotten to its core, and collapsed militarily like a house of cards to the enormous east wind that was Red China, the Red Dragon. Of course, also with the strength of the bear as well heaped on top, the team overwhelming didn't even cover what had been the combined might that was both the dragon with the bear together and other allies included as well. China was on an entire other level, though, all by itself. But certainly, Russia was absolutely fairly large and strong by itself as well. Both together steamrolled America as if it were nothing. The men finally had walked for some time, Moving beyond Pakistani Al-Zarar, Al-Khalid, and VT-4 main battle tanks, both license-built Chinese designs. These tanks comprise some of the subordinate companies of the 2 tank battalions of the 17th Lancers Regiment, Al-Fad infantry fighting vehicles, and some Type 63 armor personnel carriers present as well. Surprisingly, at one time in the past, Pakistan had purchased thousands of American M113 armor personnel carriers, which still equipped many of their units when America was invaded. However, Pakistan gradually had been buying or license building Chinese weapons and vehicles to revamp and improve their military capabilities. Military vehicles within the past 20 years had become some of the most advanced and capable in the entire world, with it obviously being the leader in tank, infantry fighting vehicle, and even armor personnel carrier designs, as there were really no serious contenders in terms of the advantages in protection systems, which were ahead of many others, and also in the type of tungsten alloyed armor protection itself of the newer vehicles, insofar as it related to within the rolled homogeneous steel armors, with added applique armor, or ERA kits to boot. The optical sighting technologies and abilities of the tanks and infantry fighting vehicles to track multiple targets at once with millimeter wave radars, along with new radios and combat data links and more, made China the world leader of military designs, alongside of Russia, Germany, and before America began to fall behind itself due to internal economic, financial, and supply chain issues, they too were definitely up there in terms of their designs. However, America really hadn't created anything new besides a few aircraft and ship designs in terms of ground vehicle designs in over 40 years. This allowed other nations to gain the lead in such matters, especially China. The men now with their military forces they once were part of were now crushed. They went on now to start a new life to resist the occupation forces. Sgt Richardson and Staff Sergeant Roberts still were stunned and in utter disbelief over what had occurred with the PLA soldier just letting them go just like that. An anomaly for sure, and one of the more bizarre ones at that. It sure wasn't something to be taken for granted, and reminded Sgt Richardson that his enemy was still human despite fighting them on the field of battle. Just because men try to wipe each other out, or take them against their will as prisoners of war, doesn't mean that they're monsters per se. Merely other men pitted against you and ordered to do you in was all they were. Just other men. That was the way of the world that these men lived in and now found themselves. Now they just had to navigate all of it as they sought a way out. Finally, they managed to leave the city, still pretending to be old men and playing the role to the very best of their ability. They passed multiple small Pakistani army checkpoints, simply where they had a vehicle guarding an area with some concertina wire stretched out near the vehicle, with troops standing guard to watch the streets. They passed several, and were allowed to pass with no trouble or issues whatsoever at all. Not one time were they actually even checked, as the Chi-Coms had actually done. No, they were waved through and written off as old men and harmless by the Pakistani troops. Exactly the difference between they and the Chinese and other forces, as before mentioned. As Sergeant Richardson and Staff Sergeant Roberts passed the final checkpoint out of the outermost suburbs beyond Alexandria, he tried to head out into the farmland now appearing in the distance to find a hiding place for the night. Somewhere, anywhere, where the likelihood of seeing enemy troops, at least for now. But in the countryside, for now, it was slim to none. The Pakistani soldiers armed with a combo of both Type 56 rifles and PK-21 AK patterned rifles made in Pakistan were watching the men casually as they passed them. Others of their squad kicked a soccer ball up and down, having fun while so doing. They felt they earned their hard-won victory and could now cut loose a bit and enjoy themselves. Sergeant Richardson and Staff Sergeant Roberts walking off into the night, now lacking their NVGs, weapons, and armor, they had to give up to play their role, all as they walked past the floodlights of all the different vehicles lighting up the city and immediate surrounding areas. Now they walked off and into the night and into the abyss of war and occupation, unsure of their futures, but had their plans to start or join an armed resistance group, thus to become partisans and fight, therefore, against the occupying powers. Sadly, Staff Sergeant Roberts would fall in battle only 4 months later, as he parted ways with Sergeant Richardson, thereby joining another ill-fated group who was largely wiped out in earlier battles. This, as many partisan groups were scarcely yet prepared to adequately face down the threats posed and possessed by the occupation forces, and lacked real logistical capabilities to enable them to operate anywhere and at any time, at least for now. Logistics meant everything in war, and lacking wider capabilities as it related to such always proved a severe hindrance on operational planning and battlefield success as a whole. Then, in addition, as it pertained to Sergeant Richardson, despite starting his own small partisan group in the localities beyond the Cap City itself, thereby himself had one hell of a time with acquiring armaments and food, and therefore had to merge with a bigger, better equipped force who largely possessed these items. Sergeant Richardson and his element would eventually move to and settle into the Appalachian Mountains to the general northwest in what had been Maryland State. His group would conduct very short 5-minute raids on their enemies, intended to gradually chisel away at them. Their strategy was actually one of the more effective ones, this despite the very small damage it did physically speaking. It was far more effective in terms of pure psychological effect, at least. Sergeant Richardson, for the time being, would have to take it. He grilled his group, training every moment possible to keep them up to task. They coordinated everything by time, so all had to wear their watches. This being done, of course, as no forms of rapid communication existed for the American side. Therefore, conducting operations through time coordination with pre-agreed to times for certain actions, was one of the very best means by which to conduct such. Insofar as Sgt Richardson's best operations, his group would alternate between hitting tiny convoys, typically supply convoys, which were more lightly armed, or they'd hit enemy garrisons consisting of tiny combat outposts manned by lighter units. One time, even, Sgt Richardson led a stealthy raid into a giant red zone of the cap city itself, there to gather intel on what was happening within its fortified walls. Indeed, the Chi-Coms had fortified the whole metropolitan area, building up HESCO-like barrier walls. In addition to those were concrete T-walls and concertina and barbed wire fencing everywhere. Also, minefields outside the perimeter, and portable chain-link fencing in certain areas to boot. He and a handful of his men had found a proverbial hole in the armor of the city's perimeter defenses, finding a way underground through drainage systems that were frivolous to the PLA and weren't yet completely secured as a result of them having been overlooked. Be that as it were, this was the only feasible way he was able to even enter, and thus had achieved his aims within the dark of night. Gathering his intel, he realized that the city was absolutely a beefed-up fortified zone, filled with ample guard forces, neighborhoods clear of rubble from several years now of slave labor. The new buildings constructed were of a Chinese communist architectural style. New homes, too, for the colonists. He was able to sneak around with some others in the dark of night. All of this while wearing captured Chi-Com uniforms from the previously deceased. Of course, this disguise worked in the dark of night, and only if maintaining proper distance from the enemy troops themselves, and maintaining military discipline in one's own movements and behaviors. This process of rebuilding cities in China's image was attempting to be repeated throughout the defeated, vanquished nation. Of course, within its confines, there were CCP and Xi propaganda posters and red banners and flags all over the city. Included in the areas with applied decorations of Chinese propaganda and red banners and flags were the original previous regime monuments and structures, including the cap and presidential residence, the latter now the new home of the comrade colonial governor from China, administratively managing New China. Despite such being the case, many areas couldn't fully transition into a Sinofied colonial zone, as the war remained a constant, severe hindrance to such. Sgt Richardson was successful in seeing the inside of the most highly defended red zone of all the red zones within the whole land. It was in many areas still wrecked from war, especially on the eastern suburban side of the metro area as a whole, but slaves were busy working to clear the way for new colonial structures. Also, the colonists themselves to live and work there in addition to such occurring. He witnessed the new bars and restaurants recently built, and the street signs, all in Mandarin, along with CCP party flags everywhere, as well as Chinese national flags. Xi spoke on a portable plasma TV screen outdoors, powered via generator, as he and others marched past, thereby attempting to blend in as best as they could by marching in squad formation in 2 columns of 5 men, with Sgt Richardson leading the way, pretending to be the squad leader of a Chi-Com force. Certainly, the men couldn't go in any of the few newer buildings constructed, as of course they'd be caught doing so. There also were Lao guys within the red zone itself, fenced off for the slave laborers who were rebuilding the city now in China's image, thereby imprisoned inside these horrible places. Included in the city now were Chinese-style high-rises even, currently under construction for the new colonists to live within. There were few older buildings left remaining, but such were repaired and utilized for various purposes. Vehicles and troops rolled down the streets in their vehicles, as did many marching or walking casually, likely off duty of the latter. There were bordellos for sex slaves in the Lao guys as well, and many off-duty troops were headed into those to spend some of their hard-earned deployment money. Sgt Richardson, disgusted and even in awe at some of the various sights he had seen thus far, left the area with ample intel about all that was occurring within the cap city, now turned into what was called G City Number 1, as its official new name. It was the colonial capital of New China. Mandarin road signs were all over, which confused Sgt Richardson at times while attempting to navigate the city, as the English signs, all removed, if they weren't already destroyed in battle years earlier during the invasion. He literally didn't recognize it. Essentially, it was like a new, different city within a foreign nation, only it was here, inside the former USA. It was a heavily militarized, despotic police state atmosphere, complete with concentration camps within the former city limits itself. Sgt Richardson could hear the sounds of men being beaten or yelling from various other methods of torture at the hands of the PAP guards while walking down a street past one of these Lao guys. It was all eerie beyond all comprehension. Sgt Richardson fantasized about liberating them, which in an area packed with one whole group army of PLA troops, along with also PAP forces of various sizes, would be indeed a death wish for he and his men to even attempt. Eventually, Sgt Richardson and his men found their way back out to wherein they'd come from to initially infiltrate the city. Onward in time, as matters changed and the fighting continued, Sgt Richardson's group, as did many others, began acquiring new weapons. They also had fluctuating numbers, as many fell in battle while others joined or became amalgamated, grafted into the group from previous other groups that had been badly mauled during the fighting. Many partisans died, but Sgt Richardson's group nonetheless had many minor successes, using the 5-minute assault strategy, that is, thereby chiseling away gradually at enemies. Hitting smaller checkpoints, patrols, and supply convoys certainly paid dividends. This especially rang true when a bounty of supplies was seized by his group. By the second year of the war, before the present time, Sgt. Richardson and his group became far more aggressive and were increasingly better armed. One man within his group had actually managed to even shoot down a Pakistani Army Mi-35E attack helicopter, which also carried a squad of air assault troops at the present time it was taken down. This helo was of the 31st Army Aviation Combat Squadron of the Pakistani Army, having been recently deployed to the mountainous areas of Maryland and West Virginia. There were, at the time, several of these attack helos flying on a patrol to hunt partisans within the local mountains to the west of the Cap region. Having attained the element of surprise, one of Sgt. Richardson's men, with a Chinese-made FN-6 portable air defense weapon, took aim, locked on, and fired the deadly missile. Thus, it had hit the last helo of the group, causing a blast which sent it smoking while falling from the sky and crashing violently into the ground. After all, of course, Sgt. Richardson and his men fled within the forested mountain foothills, all as the remaining gunships then circled the area, viciously hunting the partisans, firing their GUV 8700 30mm blasting rounds all over the forests, also firing their 9M17 Pvt anti-tank missiles alongside of their nasty salvos of S5 55mm rockets firing from their 57mm pods. 32 rockets per 2 pods per helo. Whole areas were utterly saturated by the destructively lethal firepower, blasting trees into splintering missiles, along with rocks and soil flying all over. Some of Sgt. Richardson's men actually did get caught up in the counterstrike, but many of Sgt. Richardson's partisans managed to escape, fortunately for them, due to chaff and flares. Another attempt at further attacks on the now alert helos would have been costly and self-destructive to even try, so they therefore had fled before the counterstrike had initiated. Also, by that time, the radar warning receivers had discovered the whereabouts on the ground wherein the missile had been fired from, knocking the first helicopter out of the air. Hence came the potent response that wiped out a handful of those who failed to escape the area fast enough. Men fell in battle often, as the occupier held the weapons, technologies, and personnel numbers and vehicles in their advantage. These forces were well trained and extremely motivated as well. Another time, following that small victory over the attack helo of the Pakistani Army, also during year number 2, later on, there came a partisan assault by Sgt. Richardson's group that went horribly wrong. He had chosen to attack a PAP combat outpost with the intent to hit back at the most notorious, brutal, hated enemy on the proverbial and literal map. These forces were responsible, by and large, for the extermination and atrocities occurring throughout the entire war. Not that other forces present weren't brutal at times, as all fighting forces possessed the propensity to do brutal acts. It was that this force was an expert in terms of brutality, medieval style. This PAP garrison was in an outpost along a major former interstate running through the mountains. Interstate 70 was a major thoroughfare leading into the new colonial cap city with many garrisons in the sense of forward operating bases, combat outposts, and depots and various other installations all along the major routes. This PAP base had one purpose: to guard a section of the route and provide oversight security and route clearance. 2 battalions strong were stationed in the forward operating base here near Hagerstown, formerly of Maryland, now a flattened small city. Sgt Richardson's grouping was now several hundred strong by this point, with many casualties having had occurred, but new members likewise also grafted into his group, as his numbers thus fluctuated along these lines, fairly on a normal basis. Their timed plan was as so: to emerge on all-terrain vehicles as well as captured CHICOM VP scout vehicles to fight the PAP by simply hitting them at their small checkpoints outside of their main forward operating base before rushing back into the relative safety of the forest. Obviously, Sgt Richardson knew he had no real chances against the larger PAP concentration of troops back in their FOB, so he opted instead to hit their smaller outer garrisons, including this one along the highway. Among the scattered checkpoints were also some satellite combat outposts of the FOB, holding several hundred troops in their various different companies. This was a lighter PAP element, mechanized infantry in WZ-551s, both the armor personnel and infantry fighting vehicle variations. These deadly wheeled armor personnel carriers and infantry fighting vehicles boasted 12.7 millimeter heavy W85 turret machine guns and 25 millimeter autocannons with 7.62 by 54 millimeter coax guns, respectively, as it related to the APC and IFV variations of the wheeled combat vehicles. Sgt Richardson and his group timed their attack on these highway checkpoints and observation posts while picking an area a bit further from their supporting combat outpost and even larger local FOB. Upon the partisan operation beginning, it began initially successful, with the partisan ambush wiping out about 30 PAP combat troops on guard duty. However, the rest snapped into action as soon as they seen their comrades hastily picked off by the sighted-in and rapid partisan fire from small arms and some ordnance-based weapons. RPG rockets blasted areas of sandbag positions and fortified booths and guard towers. There were even areas of HESCO-like barriers set up and packed with earth to serve as walls alongside of the highway. Upon the HESCOs were CCP flags along with national flags of China waving in spotlights at night within these checkpoint areas along the highways. Of course, on the fortified concrete machine gun booths Sitting in between the two sides of the four-lane interstate were CCP posters of Xi and other propaganda imagery slapped on these booths. Beyond these were other PAP men who came running into the direction from openings between the HESCO barriers and concrete T-walls. Also were other towers on the other side of the highway and walled-off areas wherein machine gunners snapped into action, firing their QJ-Y88 light machine guns and larger Type 67 general-purpose machine guns, others joining in even with their heavy W85 machine guns, now spraying potent, nasty 12.7 millimeter rounds downrange at the partisan attackers. Blocking part of the partisans' fields of fire were, of course, the aforementioned HESCO and T-walls on their side of the highway, wherein they appeared to carry out their ambush. Even so, there fortunately were no PAP fortified machine gun nests or towers on the side they were attacking from, but it was still perilous. This, as the towers on the other side and fortified booths in the center, manned by the PAP, could orient their firepower towards them during their assault from up on the wooded hills. In addition to the other side of the highway, that was their motor pool and camp for the troops manning the checkpoint, being complete with tents and towers behind the HESCO fortifications and T-walls over on the other side of the highway. As the partisans drove in on their all-terrain vehicles, they fired HJ-08 anti-tank missiles at the Chi-Coms off of the backs of their all-terrain vehicles upon stopping them within a safe distance to where these weapons were still effective. Of the VP scout vehicles taken by the partisans, they too pulled in and fired their own mounted W-85 heavy machine guns at the PAP troops. It was a nasty, albeit meant to be short, firefight. Already, only literally several minutes into it, 2 platoons of the PAP were under attack at their checkpoint and observation posts in their small stretch of highway, 30 of which had been slain near immediately when the partisans had the element of surprise. Now, however, upon the surprise having worn off, these elite shock troops snapped to it, letting their weapons rip and their vehicles just beyond the HESCO barriers on their campside of the highway having had been fired up and ready to move. In the midst of the fighting, the partisans in their own mix of vehicles failed to hear the PAP vehicles now starting up from the noise due to the noise of their own. This inadvertently led to many partisans being slaughtered, as these vehicles on the other side of the highway behind the HESCOs pulled literally right up to them, to where their turrets could fire over the top of them, thereby protecting them from anti-tank weapons from behind the barriers. This strategy paid off, and 25 millimeter rounds flying, which blasted like grenade impacts upon each blast, now ripped away at the partisans on their all-terrain vehicles and few VP scout vehicles, simply ripping them all up and tossing around the shredded wreckage with the bodies along with it. These 25 millimeter rounds were simply far too much for the Americans to contend with, not to mention the other crew-serve weapons already in use by the PAP troops when the battle initiated. As hundreds of his men now perished in mere minutes, they fired RPGs and anti-tank missiles, but to little avail, although they did kill several more PAP troops, but the casualty rate was now horribly lopsided. Of course, the PAP were combat experts and frequently used in counterinsurgency warfare against irregulars and as shock troops against ordinary regular forces, such as other militaries or paramilitary elements. They were proverbial combat dental floss, so to speak. Now, the PAP WZ-551 vehicles of armor personnel and infantry fighting vehicle varieties began to pool around the HESCOs, moving through openings to enter the highway itself. As the partisans were stuck on one side of the highway, as it proved too difficult to cross it under the guard of the enemy, this assault was meant to simply chisel away at the hated PAP, but in so doing proved to be a disaster. Falling back as the men perished en masse, the wounded were attempted to be rescued, all as other men risked it all in order to pull them out of the pandemonium now currently unfolding. Blasting 25mm autocannon rounds continued amid the various wall of lead coming from several calibers of machine gun ammo, along with the steady blaring of rifles to boot. As rounds splashed and others blasted of the larger variety, men died even as they fled. The attack now fell apart as Sgt Richardson fired an AT rocket from a Type 69 rocket-propelled grenade weapon he carried, and thus in turn, as his rocket crashed into a WZ-551 armor personnel carrier, thus damaging it, he was badly injured as a 25mm autocannon round impacted the ground about 12 meters away at an angle into the dirt. The shrapnel eruption from the soil-ridden cloud emerging caused it all to go dark on Sgt Richardson, not only from all the soil and rocks and plant matter now flying into him directly, but because he was knocked unconscious. Truly blessed that he wasn't outright KIA'd from the hellish weaponry thereby employed against him. After all, the same blast that injured him totally wiped out 4 other men near him. He also was shot by several 5.8 by 42mm rounds as the devastating 25mm autocannon almost completely killed him in its blasting payloads. It all happened in literally a second as various firepower was vectored in his direction. This as he and another man fired their RPG rockets at the PAP troops within their powerful vehicles. When he came to, he was then underground in a makeshift partisan hospital. He'd been hit in the leg by machine gun rounds and arms as well, and also from shrapnel that caught him in the face. He required hasty emergency care for wounds thus sustained. His group had medical personnel from both civilian and military life, but his facial injuries required delicate care, and due to no more modern medical facilities with facial reconstruction capabilities available to the Americans, Sgt Richardson would live the rest of his life as a horribly disfigured man from the shrapnel wounds sustained, simply only able to pick out the sharp, nasty metal fragments that ripped up his flesh. They had to practically smother his face with various ointments, wrap it, and hope and pray skin would somehow grow back. His face, after multiple months of being out of the fight as the group's then official leader, finally became a lump of scar tissue all throughout, with his nose even missing a piece formerly part of it, with his right nostril having been healed back from a piece of shrapnel even stuck there as well, where it had severed the nostril. Sergeant Richardson was left looking almost like a monster. He also had a piece of shrapnel that got stuck into his forehead, pulled out of the bone itself. His skull was now damaged as a result. Finally, there was the small piece that ripped into his cheek, leaving a long and nasty scar there. He was truly blessed to have not only been on the edge of the blast of the 25 millimeter impacts, but also to have been rescued by some of his remaining able-bodied men who risked their lives to pull him and several others out of the area, all while under heavy fire from the PAP. In addition, Sergeant Richardson was blessed that the non-combatants within his overall group possessed medical and other ancillary skills important for survival in war. Obviously, this included the medical personnel who were somehow able to do a lot with very little. Indeed, many salvaged as many medical supplies as they feasibly could, taking it along with them as they had fled earlier in the war. But such supplies were extremely limited and by now were getting dangerously low. However, there were occasionally successful raids upon enemy supplies. These raids partially replenished the medical supplies here and there. His gunshot wounds didn't leave him much better, and made his walking quite difficult, as bone and muscle were thereby blasted out, as were within his arms. Fortunately, his armor and helmet protected the rest of his head and vital organs from shrapnel, and the armor caught a few of the smaller rounds. His survival of the concussive blast wave and bullets was no small miracle in light of everything that had occurred. Many of the group's combatant forces had perished in that short firefight with the PAP, which all occurred within merely a 35-minute time span. This, of course, lasting far longer than originally desired, but breaking contact with the alert PAP troops was no simple nor small task. But it was eventually achieved, and before artillery fire missions were actually even called in, and thus began to impact the area adjacent to the highway itself. By the time these 152 millimeter shells came flying in, they smashed the entire several square miles adjacent to this stretch of highway to flatten shredded and splintered trees with craters as far as the eye could even see. This became a common fixture throughout the course of the war. Onward from the failed attack against the PAP posts, fighting valiantly against the occupation, his group would continue on to achieve some limited successes upon the battlefield, albeit at a very high cost in terms of lives lost in so doing. He himself, now severely wounded 2 years into the occupation, would barely survive to see the end of the conflict alive. He himself now horribly deformed as a result of severe injuries having been sustained by this point in the war. Sergeant Richardson surviving several gunshot wounds and even shrapnel as a result of his body armor and steel sappy plate protection. Overall, this leading to his no longer participating in an active combat role, needless to say. In addition to such, he was blessed to possess competent medical personnel operating within his group, both civilian and former military alike. These people who specialized in trauma care for related injuries, which included those sustained upon the modern battlefield. His group's medical personnel offered some of the best available care for wounded partisans out of all the groups in the area. In fact, many other partisans brought their worst trauma cases to Sgt Richardson's medical professionals. Similar to the Vietnam War, now the Americans had underground hospitals, caches, barracks, and even schools, just like the Vietnamese once had. In addition, there were also heavy strategic munition raids over large areas, leaving them moonscaped and pockmarked. In other words, desolation by massive devastation. These raids carried out by H-6K and H-20 stealth heavy strategic bombers, respectively. These raids themselves, resembling those carried out upon the Ho Chi Minh Trail in the Vietnam War, were now coming home to roost, falling upon the Americans within their own land. Sgt Richardson would then, for the rest of the war, still remain the group's leader, even though he was no longer a participant in the combat, and would continue to lead it at least as an operational planner, but no longer directly participating personally in the combat itself. End of finale part 1. Next, finale part 2.